Hey guys, Freddy here. Welcome back to another Satanic Panic video. And this time we're going to be looking at Should a Christian Play Dungeons & Dragons by William Schnobelen. His follow-up to his original Straight Talk on Dungeons & Dragons, which I covered in a previous video. Now this is basically a response to criticism of that earlier one. But I think it's worth going through it and seeing what points he brings up. But before we do that, I should mention William Schnobelen. I went into detail with him or about him in the last video. But it's worth bringing up a few points. This is a man who claims to have been a Catholic priest without having ever read the Bible. He claims to have been a Mormon priest as well, within the same 4-year block. He was also a 99th level Freemason, even though there are not 99 levels of Freemasonry. He was a Satanist. This is still all within the same 4 years. He summoned up the spirits of Adolf Hitler and Jesus Christ. He summoned up a fallen angel and had sex with it. And he was made into a vampire for a couple of years. So he had a lot going on in that time period. I'm surprised he had any time to be bothered about Dungeons & Dragons. Now, he starts off, believe it or not, it's been over 20 years since I wrote the original Straight Talk on Dungeons & Dragons, and this is copyrighted 2001. Well, his original mentions things which happened in 1990. So it's 11 years. So maybe he got all of that stuff done before, because time doesn't work the same for William as it does for the rest of us. He manages to pack a lot more into his years. Now, in that time I've received hundreds of letters and thousands of emails. The subject is surprisingly controversial even amongst Christians. This astonishes me. Why? You're making a claim about something people like, a claim which cannot be backed up with evidence, especially as we will see as we go on with this one. Why does that astonish you? If I make a claim that Ford cars are homosexual and will convert your children, that's a fairly outright weird claim, and people will find it controversial. So if you make weird claims, people will respond to that. He talks about people who use foul and abusive language in his responses and says he thinks it speaks volumes about the spiritual impact of the game. Well, I'll point out, he's made some really weird claims. And he brings up Dr. Redi a few times. And Dr. Redi was the man who traded drugs he got access to as a doctor for sexual favours from his patients. So I think the character references that are being brought up here speaks volumes of the arguments against Dungeons & Dragons. He mentions that Dungeons & Dragons has a massive influence. Books like Teen Witch, there's even a Dummy's Guide to Wicca and Witchcraft. Not all of this can be laid at the door of D&D, but the 1970s was one of the major cultural phenomena that planted the seeds that sprouted into Harry Potter. The dangers of Harry Potter. We've seen these Christians find that before. He goes into details about it and brings up different roles. Warrior, fighter, wizard, mage, priest, rogue, etc. He talks about alignment and how people will play different alignments. You can play somebody who is chaotic evil, who will enjoy doing evil actions rather than being a law-abiding citizen. But that's just an option within the game. You can do anything in fiction if you want. Tool time. Finally, to play the game, person's character needs the tools of their trade. He talks about there's some 60 different kinds of weapons, such as battle axes, crossbows and swords. Additionally, however, characters may get to choose various magical tools, spells, charms, one's talisman, potions, plus magical versions of most weapons. It is important to understand that each of the above magical artifacts exists in the real-world sorcery and witchcraft. They are just as real as swords, saddles and crossbows. So, talismans, healing potions, your paladin's Holy Avenger sword apparently all exist in the real world. The world where you can summon up fallen angels to have sex with them and speak to Adolf Hitler and Jesus, I guess. Doesn't sound like the world I live in. He talks about magic, continuing his lines that he spoke about in the last one, where a magical worldview, in his opinion, takes you away from the Christian worldview, because magic allows you to do miraculous things yourself. You can cast a spell and bring a loved one back from the dead, whereas in a Christian one, you have to get on your knees and beg a merciful God to do that for you. And having the power to do these things leads you into a certain mindset. It's an interesting argument that giving people the power to do things themselves take them away from God. I can see that being a decent argument for, as technology has enhanced our abilities to do things, why attendance to churches is falling. A closer look at the characters. So he goes through the different character classes, talking about warriors. Makes out they're soldiers, knights, or mercenaries. They're also policemen, town guardsmen, and stuff like that. Roles which he definitely could not criticise you. You wanting to act out being a cop when you're a kid, I'm betting he doesn't go around shouting at kids because they are becoming a violent character. He's obviously very critical about wizards, sorcerers, warlocks in the newer versions, and I'm not really going to deal with that. He does think that the Bible preaches that using magic is wrong. He talks about clerics or priests, and he brings up a big point about clerics using magic. They cast spells. But I think that's just a game element. A cleric is asking for divine intervention from their god. They are basically praying when they cast a spell. They are not laying out magic worlds which influences the world. They are bringing that magic down from their god. In the way that a Christian will pray for a friend who's in hospital to get better. That's just a spell. You're saying words, probably from a book. You are saying the Lord's Prayer from the Bible. So, it's just magic. It's just a different way of looking at it. And he's got a big section criticising the rogue, even though obviously the myth of the good thief, Robin Hood, stealing from the rich to give to the poor, is a big part of mythology. But he's very critical of that there's any way of making a character who steals into a good character. He goes on about spells versus prayers, as I described before. And defending the game. He brings up his elements. The 8 elements, he thinks. That, number 1, the author, me, is an idiot who knows nothing about the occult or D&D. This is the most common defence and the laziest. It's the old ad hominem argument. Well, I think we can see from Mr. Schnobellen's claims in the past, all these different religions he's been part of, all these things he claims to be an expert on. The satanic influences within the Catholic Church, the Mormon Church being full of Satanists as well. He is telling these stories without actually having done them. I think he's making a lot up. So I don't think he's an idiot who knows nothing about the occult or D&D. I think he makes up stories to make a living, which is completely acceptable. Lots of us do it. Lots of us tell stories for our living, but he is preaching about stuff and just lying about the influences. He's not making it clear that he's talking about fiction. D&D materials do not really say the things which the older article says they say. Well, we had a look last time where we looked through the real magic, and the spells tell you to point that you should be rolling dice for healing or damage or whatever. They do not tell you to be dancing on the spot with one leg raised while saying this particular spell. But we come to a point about this in a bit. But I don't think the D&D materials say what he claims they say in the way that most people would accept it. It's only a game, it's not real. Very true. You don't make anybody bankrupt and homeless when you play Monopoly. And there's no danger in playing D&D because its rituals are not based on the real magic. Well, again, we've covered that, they're not based on the real magic. Although, as I said, we will come on to his argument that they do. The suicide, homicide, mental illness issues are grossly overplayed and part of hysteria, which swept through evangelical Christianity in the 1980s. This last is primarily based on an article by Jeff Freeman. Well, I agree that it's overclaimed, and we will come on to that as he deals with that. The straight talk is old, out of date. I don't think that's any argument at all. As you write something, it does get older. I deal with it on the grounds of when it was written. When we, the email and friends, play D&D, we do not do these nasty things. It's a decent argument. It's not a great argument against it, but it's the same argument that gun owners use. Everybody should be allowed to have assault rifles to defend themselves because we use them responsibly. I don't find it a fantastic defense, and he's quite right to strike that one down. And the game offers positive skill development. Well, as I've said many times in the past, it led to my math skills becoming better, my speaking skills becoming much better, and my reading skills becoming far better, because before that I had no interest in these things. And experiencing them, doing them regularly, helped me out. I'm definitely far better at all of these things because I play role-playing games. Examining the issues. Two of these can be dismissed quickly. The first is obviously personal attack, which is baseless. My occult credentials are well established, my IQ is comfortably above idiocy. Yes, he's a very smart talker. Doesn't make him a truth teller. I played D&D a few times and spent dozens of hours talking with players and DMs. My first-hand experience with D&D is from the 70s, 80s. I still think counts for something. Has the game changed that much? Well, it kind of actually has. It's a very different game now. But his criticisms are still against points which don't exist in the old game, so don't exist in the new one. So his invalid arguments are still invalid. The age of the article, yes, it's old, and that's why this article exists. Rearranging the lawn chairs in hell. Now, this section's going into the arguments I've already dealt with, where he's saying the biblical worldview versus the magical worldview and people having power leads to them leaving Christianity. I don't see any extra points he raises which are worthwhile. It's only a game. He makes a point about it being dangerous, much like a game of Russian roulette or chicken if you're charging a car at another car in a game of chicken, that those are dangerous. But you've got to prove they're dangerous. Russian roulette is provably dangerous. A bullet can kill. Cars can crash into each other and kill people. But playing Dungeons & Dragons, while it's just a game, you've got to prove that what you're doing in the game can be dangerous. You can play Russian roulette with a cap gun, which won't be dangerous. It's still Russian roulette, and it's safe. Carrying on, though, he comes on to real magic. Another contention often shared with me in email is that there's nothing like real magic in the game. Well, as I said, we went through that in the last video. We went through various versions of Dungeons & Dragons, most of them, and looked at spells and could not find any evidence that they show the rituals, the incantations, or any suggestion of what you should actually do. The nearest we came to was Raise Dead, where you point. And that's all it said. You point at the person you want to raise from the dead. That was the nearest to any ritual, so pointing to me doesn't seem like a complex ritual. However, he makes a point here. Ceremonial magic can be very much high church with robes, incense, and elaborate rites. True hermetic magic involves little more than the human mind. One D&D defender wrote, "When I play the game, I might roll the dice, and depending on the result, state that I cast an invisibility spell." His point was, how is that like real magic? In mental or hermetic magic, it is exactly like real magic, except of course for the dice. It's all in the intent, in the mind. It's not whether or not you are waving a sword around. Well, wizards wouldn't generally wave swords, but let's cast that aside. So, Dungeons & Dragons teaches you how to cast real spells by you saying you're casting a spell. That's his argument, that the rituals and all that don't have to be in the book, because there are no rituals. So everything could be. Harry Potter actually gives you magic words, so it is far worse in his mind, surely, because it's the intent for people to cast a spell when they say those words. So they are casting real magic. I'm surprised we don't see more happen in the world, though, with all these people going around casting real spells. Everybody who plays D&D has access to real magic. Everybody who reads Harry Potter has access to real magic. So I'm very surprised we don't see big effects. But he also comments on how learning to use magic, even within a game, shapes your real-world view. He compares this to when he worked in a foundry in Milwaukee. He was around people who swore a lot, so he started to swear a lot, and it took him many years to stop doing that. I don't know whether this was within the same 4 years that he was a Catholic priest, a Mormon priest, a Satanist, and a 99th level Freemason. Maybe it was different years. But I can see what he's getting at. That if you are doing violence in a game, that might carry across into your real world thinking. But we would require some evidence of this. You can make lots of claims without providing evidence, but nobody's going to act on them until you actually show that these things do happen. Suicide and madness. Accusation being made that much of the anti-D&D literature in the 1980s were based on hype and hysteria. So he's talking about the claims of various suicides and all of that. And he writes a very big section on this. But he comes to a point. People in the past have claimed that the few suicides that they've managed to gather up, usually Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons and William Schnobel himself, come up with a list of about 20 people who they claim committed suicide because of D&D. Which is absolutely tragic, of course. But 20 people out of a claimed 8 million people who are playing it over an 8-year period is very tiny compared to just the average of suicides. But he makes the argument that the amount of suicides would just be a subsection. Because D&D players are between 13 and 20 years of age, a large majority are male, they're sensitive and shy individuals, they have below average social skills, they often march to the beat of a different drummer. So it shouldn't be that massive amount who are out of an 8 million population. Except that it's an average. So even if you take a subset, you would still be getting an average of that. Unless the amount of people who commit suicide within that particular demographic is less. So, if I flick to a Wikipedia article, list of countries by suicide rate, we can see the United States, as most figures will be based on that. The average is 14.5%. However, the male to female ratio is way off, very, very different. So at 14.5%, 8 million people, so every year you would expect there to be 1,160 suicides. Over 8 years, that becomes 9,280 suicides. However, if you cut women out of that demographic and just look at men, that jumps up to 14,336. And you've managed to document 20. You claim to have maybe 200 on a list somewhere which you won't show anybody. But you talk about 20 that you claim to have firm connections from, which we will come on to in a second, because we will look through his list and see how many we can confirm connections to. But you've got a big job there, taking those 20 and claiming that is any way representative of an above average amount of role players committing suicide or committing acts of violence, when the average says there should be 14,000 men doing that, or 9,000 in the general population. You've only got 20 over an 8-year period. Continuing through, he's talking about people being against Christianity and their arguments. He continues not only to bash Christians, but also police. Well, I think can be some criticisms levelled at the police, especially when we come on to this list. So here we are with his list of 12 people. I claimed it was 20 there, didn't I? It's actually only 12. In the first one it was 11, but he's increased it to 12 here. So he has a very long way to go. He only has 0.1% of the amount that he claims he probably should have. And these are not a very good list. Let's go back to a more close look. So, number 1, the freeway killer Vernon Butts, who committed suicide in his cell in 1987. Well, first of all, Vernon Butts is not the freeway killer. Vernon Butts is the freeway killer's sidekick. A small point, but a valid one. that Vernon Butts only assisted with these. So his claims about Dungeons and Dragons and his arguments that he was influenced by a game, which we'll come and see again, that many people claim that they were influenced by the game, wasn't my fault. I shouldn't be put to death for all the murders I did. Number 2, a D&D player, 14-year-old, commits suicide by hanging, 1979, name withheld by parents' request. Well, it's good that you withheld that name, but it's really weird that you're just coming up with a 14-year-old. Why not claim more? It's not any evidence. We can't research this at all. D&D player, 17-year-old Michael Dempsey, suicide by gunshot to the head. Witnesses saw him trying to summon up D&D demons just minutes before he's dead. Well, this is a rather odd case, because this is the son of a police officer who shot himself with his dad's gun because his dad wasn't allowing him to interact with his friends and play D&D. I think more specifically it was a computer game rather than tabletop. The reference to D&D demons is because his dad burst into the room at the sound of the gunshot and smelt sulphur. Now, if you've ever smelt a gunshot, it kind of smells like sulphur. So I think it's more likely to have been the gun rather than an actual demon. D&D player Steve Locano, suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. Police report satanic writings and a suicide note like the death to D&D. Timothy Grice, suicide by shotgun blast. D&D became a reality, though he's not constrained to his life. He could leave it and return because of the game. Harold T. Collins, suicide by hanging. Well, this is another one I know. Collins was noted to be possessed by D&D as if he were living in the game. He was also in a group of people who were interacting, who were all going to hang themselves. I don't know whether it was a sexual thing. I can't remember the proper name for it, but it killed a few musicians. David Carradine died of it, basically strangling themselves to get more ecstasy in sex. But whatever it was nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons. It was this other group. So this was a Dungeons & Dragons player who committed suicide, probably through misadventure, because he was in another group of people who wanted to strangle themselves. Then we've got Daniel Irwin and Steve Irwin. Murder by brothers, shotgun blast to the head. Death was apparently the result of a death pact as part of the game, which is a lie. Daniel Irwin was a young man who was being prosecuted for Grand Theft Auto. And he wrote a suicide letter to his parents, which said, "A man without his freedom is no man at all." And then he killed himself, and his little brother killed himself because he couldn't live without him. Now this sounds a lot like the police, the detective report. No doubt D&D cost them their lives. I'm wondering if the police felt a little guilty because they were prosecuting a young man and were going to throw him in jail, and he killed himself because of the pressure they put on him. I'm not saying he shouldn't have been punished for it, but the way that society acts towards that, especially in a young, vulnerable man, I think is terrible. And I think the police were making up a story. They were searching for anything they could blame it on rather than their actions. And certainly the two Irwin's brothers' parents have said that it should never be blamed on Dungeons & Dragons because it was one thing which gave the two boys so much pleasure, and they would never have wanted to harm the game. We've got Joseph Mallon, Salt Lake City, killing a 13-year-old. We've got Tom Sullivan Jr. got into Satanism and stabbed his mother, which I believe is a quite famous story. I think there's been a couple of television movies about that, which might make interesting episodes of this series later on. D&D player Danny Ramata went on an 8-state crime spree. In an interview, he asked, "Have you heard of Dungeons & Dragons? I had a lot to do with it." Now, this sounds again like a criminal who's blaming it on the game. Because he was not doing something to do with Dungeons & Dragons, he was robbing a shop at gunpoint. And he shot the teller, he was being hunted for it, he shot some other people, he did a big crime spree. To do with robbing a shop, nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons. So even if he was a player, this is just as much as he watched television or he liked football. There's no connection between his crime and the game. And D&D player Sean Sellers was convicted of killing his parents and a convenience store clerk in Greeley, Oklahoma. His involvement with hardcore Satanism began with D&D. According to his own testimony, praise the Lord, he became a born-again Christian sometime before his execution. So, yippee, he's a Christian. He might be a serial killer, but we'll have him. Not a serial killer, a spree killer. He was somebody, again, who was robbing a shop. This is not a Dungeons & Dragons crime. This is something else. Then he goes on to Michael Stackpole's report. Now, Michael Stackpole did some awesome work on researching everything about Patricia Pulling and going into these. In fact, much of the information that I mention in these videos is in some way drawn from Michael Stackpole's Pulling report, because he really did the best job. It's worth searching out and reading through. But he makes comments about various elements within that. Talking about Sean Sellers and things we've already gone about. He then goes on to the positive elements of D&D. Talking about, Harry Potter books got people into reading. But what are they reading? And that's his argument against Dungeons & Dragons, that people memorising Fazult's Sleep of Ages spell, what's that to be putting in their head? Well, I don't even know if that's a real spell. Is that a D&D spell? It sounds like it could be, but I've certainly not memorised all the spells in the book. I remember the basic ones, heal, magic missile. That doesn't take up a lot of mind space. Talks about using D&D as a template, because it brings in a world where there's lots of gods rather than one. Which is an interesting point, although the Bible does that as well. The first commandment, take no other gods before me, is admitting there's other gods. The Bible tells you there are multiple gods, that you're just supposed to worship Jehovah. Why does it say that? Because it was written during Roman times, when they had lots of household gods and gods for this, that, and the next thing. Gods of wine. And continuing through. And this is not just chess, football, or bridge. This is a game which envelops the player in an entirely different fantasy world, which the power of magic and violence is pervasive. It is a game with a distinct and seductive spiritual worldview that is diametrically opposed to the Bible. Yes, sorcery appears in the Bible, but it is never the context of a good thing to do. No, wait a second. Let us go back to the very first step. Abstain for all appearance of evil is his very first claim in his first thing. So the Bible has sorcery, and sorcery is evil. So why is the Bible not abstaining from talking about sorcery, if sorcery is evil and you should abstain and have nothing to do with it? Now I can see why reasons you'd want to, but if you're going by your own rules, the Bible's breaking it. As it probably does in millions of other ways, let's be honest. But that is the second one. Now, I've kind of briefly gone through this because it is very long. I will link to it in the description down below if you want to read through it for yourself. There's a few things which I've skipped over, which I probably should have mentioned, but I think we've gone over the big details, especially from somebody like William Schnobellen, who has such an outrageously odd worldview. Anyway, I've been waffling on quite enough, so thank you very much for watching. As always, most of all, you look after yourselves. And I'll catch you later. Bye now.